He says he's going to shut down his computer and start again. Here comes George.
George, hi.
Hi Franny, hi Peter. I have got a snazzy new microphone. So this should be quite high quality sound. How does it sound to you?
It sounds fine. Absolutely fine.
Fine? Is that all you got to say? Fine?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Hi Faiza.
Hi, Faiza.
How are you all coping with the self-isolation?
Been living in jogging bottoms, which is quite nice.
How about you?
Well, I've been self-isolating for 57 years. So.
Hi, Caroline.
Hi Caroline.
Hi.
Would you like to tip your camera very slightly down so you're a little bit higher in the frame? That's lovely. Thank you.
Cleared the sofa in honour of the occasion.
Okay, take two. Faiza, George, Caroline.
I'm sorry, Faiza, you seem to have frozen again. I don't know. We're really having a connection problem today. I'm so sorry.
Now I understand why people fly to meetings.
The Flip.
I'm Faiza Shaheen. I'm the Director of CLASS, the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, and I'm joining you from East London.
I'm George Monbiot. I'm a writer and journalist and environmental activist, and I'm joining you from my office in Oxford.
I'm Caroline Lucas, the Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion, joining you from my rather messy room in my home in Brighton.
Political life doesn't change smoothly and gradually. What we tend to see are these long periods of stasis followed by sudden rupture. And during the stasis, we're constantly told that nothing can change. We're told there's no alternative. And anyone who suggests an alternative, who puts forward proposals for radical change, is dismissed as a lunatic. And everything we might want to see happening to create a fairer world, a greener world, we're just constantly told that is hopelessly unrealistic. Don't be ridiculous. And then a rupture happens, and suddenly the totally impossible becomes not only possible, but inevitable. And the things we were told that no government could ever possibly contemplate instantly become policy. And this is exactly what we've seen in response to the pandemic. These ultra neoliberal governments, which insisted that the only political option was to shrink the state and cut down and privatize public services and reduce the economic safety net and put growth ahead of all other priorities, suddenly they're throwing money at economic welfare, public services, they're issuing diktats that all homeless people must be instantly housed. They're even discussing the possibility of a universal basic income. So it can be done, after all. In other words, a flip has happened, and now we need to see a similar flip to address an even greater crisis than COVID-19, which is the gathering collapse of our life support systems. In fact, it's the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced. Now, if we can do this for the pandemic, if we can change almost everything, put society, politics, economics on a completely different footing as governments have done, we can and must do it for the survival of life on Earth. The response to this crisis, the coronavirus crisis, shows us that the impossible is actually eminently possible. It should fill us with courage and determination in pursuing our demands for a fairer and greener world.
I think that the flip is a way of learning together in real time from our experience of the greatest global social upheaval in recent times. Not because any of us wanted this, ever, but because how we act now and through this pandemic, I think, will shape our collective futures. And I think we should be in no doubt that there will be very loud vested interests when we come through the other side who will be desperate to return to business as usual, to get back to the way things were as fast as possible, as turbocharged as possible. But I think it's really important to recognise that the status quo hasn't worked for the vast majority of people. That an economy that is focused on the extraction of profit and endless economic growth has eroded, if you like, our collective immune system by undermining and underfunding our health and social security systems, by impoverishing people here and right around the world, and by destroying climate and nature. But I think if we choose to, we can lay the groundwork now for a fairer, greener, more resilient recovery, and rebuild a society that is more equal, yes, more resilient, where people and nature thrive, and where all of us have a louder say in what happens next.
The flip for me is really playing out in a real 180 degrees flip in our mindsets. And I think you see that from government all the way down to everyday people that are suddenly not accepting this idea that people working in supermarkets, that are carers, are low skilled, which just weeks ago was the common terminology used. And so it's really making people think about the value of people and the value of the work we do. It's really making us understand that we're not just individuals, that we are interconnected in all kinds of ways, that we rely on each other, that the health of the poorest in society will affect those all to the very top. And we are in this issue of this public health crisis together, and we depend on each other, and we need each other, and we need each other to be well. And finally, the flip has been about money and how much money is available for the NHS, for people, and to make sure that we are doing something about wages, for instance. And this is such a dramatic turnaround in a very short period of time. And the real challenge now is that this isn't just a short-term blip, that we go out clapping for NHS workers and carers on Thursday for a few weeks while the public health crisis is at its peak, and then we just go back to normal. The big challenge now is how we make sure that this change in mindset is for the long term, that we push people to see that everything that's come before, and in particular the last decade of austerity, but even longer than that in terms of our focus on profit over people and the planet, that can no longer be the status quo, and we need a significant shift away from that. All of the wrongs of the last decade and more need to be put right. Otherwise, this crisis, we wouldn't have learned a thing from it.
I think in terms of what's already started flipping, then there is, as George said, that sense of what is politically possible. Now suddenly the parameters are as wide as our imaginations. I love the work of Rebecca Solnit, and she's talked about what happens to people in disasters. And she tells us that in many ways, disasters can give us a glimpse of who else we ourselves may be and what our society could become. And I think we are getting that glimpse right now. And obviously in many parts of the world, community resilience, the mutual aid groups have been coping strategies, survival strategies for years and years. And I think what we're seeing now is a flourishing of that here in the UK, right on our doorsteps. The fact that 2.5 million people haven't waited for government to get its act together, haven't even waited for local councils. They've just got out there and stepped up themselves. And suddenly we have a sense of ourselves, I think, not just of these individualized economic units, but as deeply social beings who need one another and find meaning in our relationships with one another, and together recognize that pretty much anything is possible. So I think what's started to flip is both that sense of what is possible, and Faiza has already talked about some of the things that government is now doing that we could never have dreamt of before. How could it be that wiping off £13 billion of NHS debt could just be done in a way that was almost like a footnote in an otherwise busy day? The fact that we are now having Conservative MPs talking about a universal basic income, it's that political possibility, but it's also, as I say, I think a reflection about who we ourselves might be. And that, I think, is really exciting, recognizing that, the people that we now understand that we have to value, and we do value most in our society, are the people that have, by successive governments, frankly, been treated really, really badly, paid really badly, labelled low skilled. They have been the bottom of the pile. And now suddenly we recognise just how much we depend on all of those people, the people stacking the shop shelves, the people who are, cleaning the hospitals, the porters, the people who are just making our society work right now. So we're revaluing ourselves, we're revaluing each other, and we're recognizing that an awful lot more is politically possible than we originally thought.
Yeah, I would totally endorse that. It's been moving, inspiring, incredible to see mutual aid groups all over the world filling the gaps of government provision. Now, I think we'd probably all agree that we need both. We have to have a state which provides an economic safety net, which funds very good public services such as health, education, and the rest, which transfers money from rich people and rich communities to poorer ones, which prevents anyone from becoming too powerful, which protects us from disaster. And of course, the state has been doing all that badly by design under our sort of neoliberal system. It's like, because, you know, according to their theology, the state's not meant to do any of those things, except perhaps protect us from foreign invasion. That's about it, really. And so they've been really crap at this stuff. And there's been, I think, a latent desire for people to step forward and to fill those gaps, because, you know, what a vast range of research in psychology and anthropology and evolutionary biology, in neuroscience tells us is that we're fundamentally good people. Our dominant values are community feeling, benevolence towards other people, empathy, altruism. We've all got some selfishness and greed in us, but those are not our dominant values. And yet we're constantly treated and told that we are people dominated by selfishness and greed. In a way we are, because there's a very small proportion of the population whose dominant values are selfishness and greed, the people we tend to call psychopaths, and they are massively overrepresented in positions of power. And broadly speaking, we're a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And boy, has that ever become apparent in the last few weeks. Mm. So, you know, one thing I really hope we hold on to is this recognition of our good nature, is that we are these incredibly mutually supportive people who defend each other through crisis, who create social institutions where those institutions are lacking, who get together to supply food and medicine to their neighbours, or get together to design a new ventilator, or to sew masks through the sewing forum, or to do all these incredible things that people around the world have done. And I hope we hold on to that and come out of this saying, hang on a minute, why are we, a society of altruists, allowing these psychopaths to govern us? Isn't it time that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the point about mutual aid groups and community stepping forward. And, you know, in the first few days when this crisis was really coming out in the media in the UK, you know, we were inundated of images of people fighting over toilet roll and the rest of it. And you really felt at that point, like, this is not a good sign for humanity. But very quickly, and something we haven't heard perhaps enough about, is this fact that people stepped forward and they wanted to find out if their neighbours were all right. And we started a mutual aid group here that very quickly went from, you know, 2 members to 200, you know, within a few hours. And so there is something very heartwarming and very hopeful about what we can see there. I think one of the flips that I've seen, and again, it remains to see if this is longer term, is the attitude towards trade unions. We've had this really interesting situation whereby we've had people like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Michael Gove thank the trade unions. The Sunday Times running a positive piece on the trade unions. And to me, I mean, that's a huge change from the way in which trade unions, who stand up for workers, who have been demonized and called dinosaurs and the rest of it, that here we are in a crisis, and governments and business are recognizing that not only do workers have a right to a seat at the table, but we need those voices. We need to know what workers need at this time, and we need to take that as seriously as business, and that, you know, in that conversation, in that crisis, we are able to come together and agree. So that's why we had the wage furlough program, is because trade unions were able to come to that table and put pressure on and voice those concerns for workers. Now, for a long time, there's been a real hierarchy in whose voice matters. And at least in the last few weeks, we're starting to see that opening up of space. And and that has to continue if we are going to tackle inequality going forward.
What this crisis has enabled us to do, in a way, is to imagine bigger things, to see no constraints towards what we can imagine. And these have been, pretty extraordinary days. Just recently, Michael Gove, of all people, was on the Andrew Marr programme. He was asked by Andrew Marr how we would pay for the different programmes the government was unfolding. And Michael Gove said, the most important thing is the lives of the vulnerable. Nothing is more important than that. And he just thought, my God, where's that been for the last 10 years? It's really blown out of the water, the idea that austerity was inevitable. Austerity was, as we always said, a political choice. But if we can imagine bigger things, if we can hold on to this idea that the politically possible is something that is always negotiable, it's not a definite thing, it's not something that can't be changed. If we can press for the politically possible to be what it needs to be when we emerge from this crisis, which is into a world where the climate crisis has not gone away, where the crisis around inequality has not gone away, and poverty. And we need to be able to marshal that same political will that has been marshaled to a much more immediate threat, because it's been visible and very obvious on a day-to-day and very appalling way. If we can marshal some of that political will to the bigger crises, which will still be there waiting for us, then that is what has to flip, that sense of what is politically possible. Never again must we allow governments to shrink the state in the way that they have. Never again must we allow governments to say that we can't afford to tackle the climate crisis. Never again can we allow them to tolerate such grotesque levels of inequality that we have both inside our country and between North and South. So I think that, basically the prize, if you like, out of all of this awfulness, and let's not forget just how hideous this is for so many people who are losing their jobs, sometimes losing their loved ones even, maybe something coming out of this might just be that we can lay down the pathway to building a better society, a greener, fairer, better society for everyone.
Yeah, there's so much that needs to change. And I think, for me, I've been thinking quite a lot about the Beveridge report that was written, during World War II, and about the 5 social ills of that time. And I've been thinking about what our social ills have been. Of course, inequality, of course, the way in which the state has been underfunded. But one big thing has been this prevalence of an anti-immigration and often xenophobic, racist narrative. And we've seen that very much in a hostile environment, our immigration policies. And, one thing that has probably struck any of us, seeing these pictures of these doctors and nurses that have died, in part because they don't have proper protective equipment, but they are black and brown faces, many of them immigrants. And these are the people going out and risking everything for us, putting their lives on the line to keep others safe. And I really hope that people can look at those pictures and look at those faces and see how the divide and rule mentality, that has said it's their fault over there, the migrants are the reason why it's hard for you to get healthcare and the rest of it, and see and wake up to the fact that that's just not true.
Yes, I would obviously completely agree with what you both said there. And my hope is that we can respond now to a chronic crisis as we've proved we can respond to an acute crisis. And really the only difference between this pandemic, except for scale and climate breakdown, is that one is acute and the other is chronic. And the acute crisis that we face now has flipped everything. It has, all over the world, national life has been completely repurposed in order to address that pandemic. Well, we urgently need to do that to address our even greater predicament, which is the collapse of our life support systems that we are facing with increasing urgency. There was a report by the UN Environment Programme last year showing that to come in at 1.5 degrees of heating and no more than that, we would need to cut emissions by 7.6% per year for the next decade. And no government anywhere on earth is on track with that. Well, things might be a bit different right at the moment because of the complete freeze on many aspects of economic life. But we can't do it that way. That's not the right way to do it. It's not going to happen by accident. It should happen by design, that we just get out of fossil fuels with a crash program. And the thing which has been obsessing me over the past few months, and I'm going to spend the next couple of years working on it, is how the hell are we going to feed ourselves if we get to 2 degrees or more of global heating? Because what an increasing tranche of scientific papers is showing us is that somewhere beyond that point, it could be 2.5, it could be 3, we don't know, at some point we're going to start seeing synchronous global harvest failures, where food supply just collapses worldwide. And this is something no one on earth has ever experienced. This has never happened in the modern era. And we think that people fighting over toilet paper looks bad. It does look bad, but it's nothing by comparison to what will happen if people are fighting over food, because we're in structural famine. I mean, already we've got structural food surplus, but hundreds of millions of people go hungry because of the inequalities in wealth and power. But imagine what that's going to be if we have a structural famine, a structural deficit of food. And that is what climate breakdown promises us. We're going to get there. If we carry on as we are, we don't know whether it's going to be at 2, 2.5, 3 or 3.5 degrees, but at some point, we're going to see the world's major bread baskets turning into dust bowls and synchronous harvest failure happening, and there not being enough food. So this is a much, much bigger emergency than coronavirus. This is the greatest existential threat that humankind has ever faced. And if we can do this for coronavirus, we have to be able to act in kind to prevent that horrendous disaster from happening.
I think the key question going forward is, how do we make the good flips stick? How do we make sure those are the ones that go forward, not all of the kinds of changes, which there'll be plenty of people out there who would want to see change in a negative way. And again, I'm going to go back to Rebecca Solnit and her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, because she talks about how every disaster shakes loose the old order. And what she says is what replaces it is up to us. And I think that just reinforces this idea that there is everything to play for, but that nothing is inevitable, nothing is foreordained. It's going to be about how we interpret this crisis, how we understand it, how we respond to it will then shape our ability to be able to hold on to the positive bits of our response to it. So to give you an example, I think actually picking up on something George just said about food, one of my frustrations about the way in which the government has responded to children who traditionally have been on free school meals but now aren't at school, therefore aren't getting free school meals. They've got as far as saying, yes, let's have some vouchers, but they haven't thought about the fact that right now they're suggesting the only place those vouchers should be redeemable is in the supermarkets. And if you're going to try and lay the foundations for a different set of values and a different kind of economy, then why would you not try to make sure those vouchers on a very small scale could be redeemable in, small local food shops, so that we're encouraging the kind of economy that we are going to need in the crisis of climate change that George has so eloquently set out. So there are things we could be doing in our response to this crisis that could put us in a better position, or indeed if we do it wrong, in a worse position when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. So on a very small scale, it might be about making sure that we embed positive supply chains when it comes to things like those food vouchers, just on a very small scale. On a bigger scale, I think we could be looking at what's happening when the airlines go cap in hand to government asking for bailouts. There's a debate to be had about whether any public money should be going to aeroplane companies, but to the extent that aviation is given support, then it absolutely has to be conditional on aviation coming up with a strategy that could begin to bring it fast in line with its climate, the climate policies that should govern every part of our economy. Because right now, if aviation continues with the business as usual plan that it had pre-coronavirus, then essentially by the time we ever got to 2050, then aviation would be basically responsible for and allocated the vast number of emissions for the whole of our economy, which is clearly crazy. So there are things we could be doing now in terms of conditioning the support that gets given to those parts of the economy that are exacerbating the climate crisis. I think we should be learning as we go along around what a Green New Deal might actually mean in practice. The debate about a Green New Deal has been going on for a long while, and it's around making sure that workers are in the forefront of the transition to a zero carbon economy, that it's not something done to workers, but workers are the ones who are themselves ensuring and leading the fight to get more resources in terms of getting retrained, in terms of income guarantees, in terms of that basic security that they will need to move away from high carbon work into low carbon work. That Green New Deal is something that we could be laying the foundations for now. So there's a whole set of positive things that we could be doing to try to embed these good flips. But I think we should be under no illusion that the other side, as it were, those who would love us to get back to a turbocharged business as usual, will also be out there. And there will be, frankly, a huge fight, I think, in terms of what happens next, because there will be plenty of industries going to government saying the only way you can get out of the huge economic crisis that is going to happen post this crisis, the recession and probably depression that we're going to face, they will say the only way you can do this is by business as usual, by more money to those industries that have been climate destroying for decades. And there is going to be one almighty fight, and we've got to make sure that all of those voices that are basically saying that the greener way forward is not something that we've got the luxury to have right now. We've got to make sure that those voices are well spoken over and outweighed by the voices of sanity that are saying that the only way to make sure that this vast crisis is livable is by making decisions that put people and climate first.
I think one thing the crisis has shown us is just what totally rubbish governments we've got in many parts of the world. And it's unsurprising to hear them taking the same anti-science and anti-human positions on coronavirus as they have on climate breakdown, and indeed on many other issues. The worst possible people are in charge at the worst possible time. And as a result, many thousands of people are dying who would not needed to have died. These are deaths which government failures have caused. So one thing I want to stick is that we determine that we will never allow such people to govern us anymore. We couldn't trust them to prevent homelessness. We couldn't trust them to ensure that people had decent wages, to ensure that universal credit succeeded, whatever it might be. We could not trust them on the climate emergency. And look what happens when we're faced with an acute emergency in societies like ours. They can't do it. They are not up to the job. So that's the message I think we've just got to hammer home again and again and again. They will let us down. They will betray us every time, because our interests are not their interests. Their interests are the interests of the billionaires. Why are the US, the UK and Australia so peculiarly crap at dealing with stuff like this? Well, partly because those are the countries in which Rupert Murdoch is super dominant, in which billionaires in general have their hands on the levers of power. There's a very interesting analysis by a Canadian professor, Kevin Mackay, showing that the civilizations that have collapsed are those where oligarchs hold inordinate power. And what do we have at the moment? We have a situation where oligarchs hold inordinate power, where through political funding, through their lobby groups, through the think tanks they fund, through the whole structure of politics now, people like Murdoch, but many other billionaires and multimillionaires have tremendous power over politics, where we got to the situation where democracies have effectively turned into oligarchies. And we see the results imposed on people every day, and they're catastrophic, and they are literally driving our civilization towards collapse because they're destroying our life support systems. So, my sense coming out of this is never again can we afford to allow these people to dominate our lives And we should refer back to the appalling failures in this country of testing, of tracking, supply of protective equipment, supply of ventilators, all of these things the government could have done. It locked down far too late. It allowed the Cheltenham Gold Cup to go ahead and a whole load of other major events. And we're now, right now, seeing the results in terms of the number of people dying. We'll remind people of that again and again and say, never again. Apart from that, no complaints.
I mean, I really feel that frustration that these are the people we have in charge at this time, and watching those press conferences day to day, you just want to pull your hair out because they won't answer a question. And it's clear, especially on issues like testing and protective equipment, that they've completely let us down, and they just won't admit it. And, in the meantime, sowing this narrative that we've got to blame China, that this is about individuals and not adhering to what government has set out. They are already playing this game, and it's classic propaganda and point fingers elsewhere. And for me, how we make good flips stick, and even how we get more people to just wake up at this time and see this world for what it really is, and see our government and this government and many others around the world for what they really are and what they really stand for. It actually does require us to think very carefully about social movements, because we are, we might not like it, but we're not close to another general election. We can't, rely on the usual political cycle in the same way. We're potentially 4 years out from another election, if not more. And we have to build momentum and not let this be forgotten. So absolutely, George is completely right that we have to keep saying the same things and messaging. But we also need to take all of those thousands and thousands of people that have joined mutual aid groups that aren't, part Labour or Green Party members often, are local people concerned for their neighbours, and think about how we politicize that movement and politicize the people that are going out and clapping right now for NHS workers, quite rightly, and get them to think that we are going to be a force, and not just when we go to vote in however many years time that will be, but right now. If our governments try and go back to carers getting paid, £8.50 an hour, we are going to join others on strikes. We are going to join others and support people. We are going to, stand outside Westminster and say, we're not going to take this anymore. We have to build that broader people movement. And we see, we saw elements of that come through kind of the Corbyn movement, and we saw people go out on the streets and door knock in the election. But how do we move that away, just beyond the electoral cycle, to be a bigger movement at this point to push for change, and absolutely say that it has to not only be about this crisis, but about the climate crisis and what needs to happen going forward. That we're not going to accept governments turning around saying this is just not a good time for those sorts of bold movements because we have to focus on getting over this crisis and then we can think about these things in a few years' time. Like, no, that can't happen. So how do we combine this new force of people that are annoyed about what's happening to NHS workers and concerned for their neighbours, and seeing maybe for the first time how difficult it is for people to live on £95 a week, or how hard it is for mums and when they're not getting free school meals, really waking up to the human suffering that some people, if you live a middle class lifestyle, you never really see. How do we combine that with the very inspirational school strikes? We have to be a force, with the trade unions, and to come together and say we are, physically going to go out and stand together, in an era past self-isolation and social distancing, and say, like, actually, we're not going to let you. And if you're going to do this, we're gonna fight against it. We're going to be there in the streets and protest and the rest of it. We're not going to be quiet. We're not just going to go back to saying, okay, well, this is how it has to be. And look, we have to learn from what happened in the financial crisis. It was the first time that I was in the very early part of my career and saw a big crisis while working as an economist at the New Economics Foundation. And really, the inability of the left and progressive thinkers to come together and at that point say, this is what needs to happen, you know, give a sheet of paper and say, this is it, this is what we need to be fighting for. But we have that with the Green New Deal. We know what we need to see. We know what we need to see happen to public services. We know what we need to see happen to immigration policy. So, you know, it's such an important time for us to just work our socks off. And I know after all of the battles we've faced in recent years, you know, that sounds exhausting, but we absolutely, like Caroline said, absolutely, like George has said, just no more. We're not taking this anymore.
While there's a lot of positivity to come out of this horrendous crisis, and, you know, we absolutely got to find the best that we can out of this terrible situation we're in, there's also, I think, a lot of danger. Things could flip completely the wrong way. We're already seeing in the United States how Trump has used the opportunity of everybody being distracted to rip down environmental regulations, absolutely following the playbook that Naomi Klein documented in the shock doctrine, showing how these people will use disasters to push through stuff that no one would ever accept in normal times. But when people are totally focused on the disaster, woof, they force through really horrendous stuff. So I think two things to look out for are, one, that disaster capitalism happening. It's already happening. We must be alert to it and must fight it as effectively as we can. But the other thing is the emergency legislation lodging beyond the end of the emergency. And you know, governments are awarding themselves massive powers at the moment, and arguably a lot of those powers are justifiable during the emergency. You know, we do have to take very seriously the spread of this pandemic and have powers which prevent people from spreading it to others. But those powers can also be used against protest. Those powers can also be used against public gatherings of any kind. And unless they're taken off the statute books, the moment this crisis is over, they will continue to be used and misused. And governments, unfortunately, have got a long track record of repurposing legislation which made sense in an emergency and keeping it on the books and using it for completely different purposes. So those are a couple of dangers I think we should be aware of, where things could flip the other way.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's maybe made more likely here in the UK right now with Parliament in suspension and still, you know, miles away from having any kind of serious virtual Parliament. It's extraordinary to me that in the 21st century we haven't got the infrastructure that would mean that, you know, Parliament and government could be held to account. And therefore, I have real worries that scrutiny isn't happening. And you know, we've already talked about the bit of the kind of pantomime of these daily press conferences where there's no real scrutiny. You know, very rarely can you actually get a minister to answer a question. That isn't what we need right now. We need the rigor of proper parliamentary scrutiny, and so we need to make sure as Parliament that we come together in whatever way we can, and if that is only virtually, then so be it, but let's make sure it's using the best possible technology. It's not beyond the wit of humankind to do this if the political will is there. So let's make sure we can hold governments to account and recognise as well that yes, environmental legislation is being ripped up in the States, but it's also at risk here in the UK, and that was before we you know, that's not even getting to the whole debate about Brexit, but it's looking at people like, you know, the Institute for Economic Affairs and Mark Littlewood saying, oh, it's great, isn't it, that we don't have the working time directive anymore, and we don't have, you know, a whole set of different environmental regulations anymore. Maybe this should be the new normal. So, you know, we've talked a lot today about potential positive things coming out of this, and you know, we have to believe that because it is so horrendous right now, and certainly that potential is there. But I don't think we should underestimate just the scale of the battle that we will have on our hands, because yeah, there are forces out there that would like society to go in a very different direction, I think.
The big issue is how much, you know, fear dominates going forward, and fear is used, fear of others, and we've seen in some countries like issues of xenophobia and racism, especially to anyone that looks Chinese, and it's it's scary that we could go down this road of just blaming certain people for not staying in the house, or blaming China, and so there is the wrong kind of flip that we could see, and within that also less expectation from the state, which seems mad to us right now, but essentially what I can already see is arguments being made, well, they couldn't really do much and they're doing the best they can, and that actually we continue on this route of having quite low expectations, and I think the real thing for us when we think about the dangers of society flipping the wrong way are also that we just don't flip, because if we continue on this path and we don't flip and there's no change, then we are hurtling on towards more disasters, and more global disasters that could make this look like, really quite minor compared to other things that could happen, massive climate crisis around the world. If we don't come out of this and, have a bigger heart, care more for each other, not just here, but for people abroad, if we don't relax some of our attitudes to refugees, if we don't consider what we do to build up health systems around the world and not just here, if we don't start to see, brown and black bodies as equal to ours, and to understand that within this country there's huge inequalities that we have to tackle, if we don't start to change our complete mindset, if that doesn't happen, then we are going to hurtle forwards to even bigger disaster. So, really for us is the biggest danger is kind of like not flipping at all, because if we come out and learn nothing from this, then it's very, very scary and even more frightening times ahead.
We are standing on the edge of the known world now. All the old certainties, the old normalities are behind us, and we really have no idea what lies ahead. I mean, as we've said in this amazing discussion, and I think it's been really brilliant. Thank you all for it. But as we've said, it could go either way. We could flip to something really wonderful, or we could flip to something really awful. But that will be determined by us. It's not a matter of chance. It's not a matter of luck, which way it goes. It's a matter of determination. It's a matter of organisation. It's a matter of mutual aid on a vast scale. It's a matter of resistance, protest, civil disobedience. We can create that new world. What this crisis has shown is that nothing is fixed. Nothing is certain. Nothing is stable. All the old certainties are bullshit. They weren't certainties at all. They were the contingencies that some people managed to force on everybody else, and to say, these are certainties, there's no alternative. That was all rubbish, complete nonsense. There are loads and loads of alternatives. There are no certainties in politics. So it's now totally up to us. We can create a new future out of the wreckage of this crisis, but also the wreckage of all the other crises, social, environmental, economic, political, that have preceded it. And we could bring something really beautiful out of this crisis, or we could lurch into an even bigger disaster. Let's do the beautiful thing.
Not easy to follow, Faiza and George. I mean, I've enjoyed this conversation because, not least because it's been a bit of relief from my inbox, and my inbox is just full of so much suffering right now. And I've never known my parliamentary work to be so busy. Just the amount of just sheer uncertainty and worry, and people just not knowing, what kind of future they're going to have, people losing their jobs, people losing loved ones, people sending off their daughters to a local hospital, not having the protective equipment that they should have. No one should be put in that position. And I guess it's reminded me of two things. One is that this pandemic does affect people differently. I mean, on the one hand, people say it's a great leveler, and that's true. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor when it attacks you and potentially kills you. But actually, the experience of being under lockdown is very different. If you've got a big house and a big garden, that's very different from being somewhere where you don't have those things and where you are genuinely worried from one day to the next as to how you're going to put food on the table, and you don't know if your job's there, and you're one of the million people that's trying to get hold of universal credit, and people aren't getting back to you because they're so overworked. I think what this pandemic has done is just reinforce the inequality, both within our country and even more so north-south. I mean, I can imagine what it must be like to be trying to deal with this pandemic, let's say in a refugee camp in Africa, for example. I mean, it's almost beyond imagination. So on the one hand, there's that sense of this dire inequality that the pandemic has revealed yet again. But also I think it's put flesh on the bones of the word solidarity. Solidarity is a word that we can use very glibly sometimes and perhaps not think about what it really means. But I think, building on what George was saying about the choices that face us, and that there's nothing foreordained about which way we come out of this crisis, whether we come out in a way that is harmful to people and planet, or whether we come out in a much more beautiful way, solidarity is going to be at the heart of the decisions that are made. And my hope is, going forward, that out of all of the awfulness of the past few months, that there is a greater understanding, and not just an academic understanding, but an emotional feeling about what solidarity really means, about really being there for your neighbour, whether you knew them before or not.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The Flip.